Silence is not weakness when it belongs to a woman who understands where every hidden door is built. At 9:42 p.m., snow pressed softly against the glass walls of Sterling and Vale Trust Bank, 38 floors above Lake Street, where the city lights of Chicago shimmered through the storm like cold coins under black water. Inside the private conference room, the air smelled of polished walnut, fresh espresso, and the faint metallic chill of a building kept too perfect for human warmth. Julian Pierce stood near the window in a midnight Brielle suit, checking his reflection in the glass while the skyline blinked behind him in silver and blue. He loved mirrors. Serena Whitlock sat at the far end of the 12-seat table, elegant in a deep red dress, her posture straight, her hands calm beside a closed Mont Blanc pen and a thin folder marked only with a gold trustee seal. She had grown up 3 bus rides from rooms like this, in a rented apartment above a laundromat on South Wabash Avenue. But scholarships, discipline, and a mind sharper than most boardrooms had carried her into the center of America's old money machinery. Most people in the room saw a beautiful wife sitting quietly behind her husband's empire, but the older bankers knew the truth in the careful way they avoided her eyes. She built the frame. Julian's new public campaign was priced at $18.6 million, a clean rebranding effort meant to present him as a guardian of family heritage after months of nervous investor calls and quiet questions about overextended assets. On the wall screen, a presentation waited under the title Heritage Renewal Initiative, with soft photographs of snow-covered stone gates, charitable language, and Brielle Ashford's name placed exactly where Serena's mother's name should have been. Brielle stood beside Julian in a champagne silk dress, smiling with the warm emptiness of someone who loved attention more than meaning. She touched the screen. Outside, the storm thickened over Lake Street, turning the traffic below into red and white threads moving between towers of glass. The conference room lights were bright enough to flatter skin, soften age, and make every legal paper look harmless from a distance. Julian had chosen the room carefully because it overlooked the city like a throne, and because tomorrow morning, at 8 a.m., the same story would be offered to donors, reporters, and investors as proof that he still controlled the future. He thought he controlled the room. Serena watched him introduce the sale without using the word sale at first. He called it repositioning, stewardship, modernization, the kind of language wealthy men used when they wanted to make taking sound like vision. Then he said the estate belonging to Serena's late mother had been transferred to a preservation group backed by Pierce Capital, and Brielle would help guide the public face of the project. The room went still. Serena felt the faint bite of cold from the window seam near her left shoulder, heard the soft click of Brielle's bracelet against the table, and noticed that the printed valuation was $72 per million, reduced by almost $9 million under market. Her mother's legacy had become a discount line. Julian smiled as if he had solved something difficult. He spoke of emotional assets needing practical hands, of old properties needing new voices, of Serena having stepped back from operational decisions for the good of the family brand. Each sentence was delivered in a calm American boardroom voice, polished enough to avoid cruelty while carrying it straight across the table. Brielle looked at Serena with a small practiced smile. Serena did not move. A junior counsel near the coffee service shifted his tablet and asked whether Mrs. Whitlock's consent was required before the morning announcement. Julian gave a soft laugh, the kind meant to end a question without answering it. He said Serena trusted him with these matters now. That was the insult. Not a raised voice, not a public scene, just the quiet removal of a woman's authority in front of people who knew she had earned it. Serena looked from the valuation page to Julian's face, and for one measured second, the city outside seemed warmer than the marriage inside that room. Julian thought he had sold her past. Serena understood he had just exposed his future. Julian let the silence sit for 3 seconds, then turned it into a smile. Under the recessed ceiling lights, his white shirt glowed against his black Brielle suit, his gold Patek Philippe catching the room's reflection each time he lifted his hand. In the darker corner near the glass wall, Serena remained still, the red of her dress muted by the blue city light, her face calm while snow dragged silver lines down the window behind her. He enjoyed the contrast. Brielle leaned closer to the presentation screen, her champagne silk dress catching the warm side lamps as if the room itself had been arranged to flatter her. Julian looked at the bankers, then at the legal team, then finally at Serena, speaking in the smooth tone he used on CNBC when markets were nervous and his investors needed theater. He said heritage could not remain frozen simply because certain people were emotionally attached to old arrangements. Serena heard everything. At 9:51 p.m., a black Lincoln Town car slid through the slush 38 floors below, its headlights briefly flashing across the glass like a blade. The room smelled of espresso turning bitter, leather chairs, and the faint ozone scent of winter pressing against sealed windows. Julian's communications director, a thin man named Prestondale, tapped his iPad and confirmed that the press embargo would lift at 8 a.m. Eastern, with Brielle listed as the public liaison for the Heritage Renewal Initiative. Brielle smiled wider. Marcelline Rowe sat 2 seats from the end of the table, silver hair pinned low, her navy suit severe, her reading glasses resting beside a stack of clean legal pages. She had not spoken since the meeting began, but her pen moved once across the margin of the transfer summary, circling one phrase with such quiet precision that the junior counsel beside her swallowed. The phrase was authorized spousal direction. It was wrong because marriage was not title. Julian laughed softly when the junior counsel raised the issue again. He said Serena had trusted him with high-level stewardship for years, and that Pierce Capital's internal governance reliance memo would satisfy any procedural concern. Then he added that some people were brilliant in the early architecture of a company, but not suited for its modern public face. The insult wore a silk tie. On the left side of the room, Julian smiled beneath honey-colored lights, one hand resting near Brielle's chair, performing confidence for bankers who billed $1,200 an hour. On the right side, in the window's cold reflection, Serena sat half-shadowed and silent, watching the snow erase Lake Street lane by lane. Between them lay a $72 per million transfer packet, a Cartier paperweight, and the empty space where respect had once pretended to live. The room split in two. Brielle finally spoke, her voice soft and polished, saying the estate needed a woman who understood beauty, not grief. She did not mention Serena's mother, the scholarship fund, the winter food drives, or the fact that the property had carried the Whitlock name long before Julian discovered how useful old grief could look in a campaign video. Julian nodded as if Brielle had just delivered strategy instead of vanity. Serena blinked once. Marcelline removed her glasses and said, in a voice flat enough to cool the table, that no governance reliance memo could override a beneficiary sole consent covenant, especially when the matriarchal Heritage Preservation Trust contained a generational deed reversion clause and a reserved heritage asset control authority. The bankers stopped moving. Julian's smile held for half a second too long. Brielle looked from face to face, searching for the part of the sentence that might still belong to her. She found none. Julian recovered first, saying Marcelline was being overly cautious and that the morning rollout could proceed while counsel refined the language. His thumb pressed against the edge of the embossed announcement card in front of him, the one bearing Brielle's name above the words Public Heritage Ambassador. The card bent once, then split along the gold foil seam with a dry, expensive crack. The only sound was the clean break of polished cardstock under his hand. Serena looked at the broken card, then at Julian. She understood now that he had not merely tried to sell her mother's estate. He had tried to rewrite the bloodline of the story, replacing a dead woman's legacy with a mistress's photograph and a billionaire's grin. Julian thought the damage was emotional. Serena knew it was evidentiary. Serena did not answer Julian, and that unsettled him more than any accusation could have. At 9:58 p.m., the snow outside thickened into a white curtain over Lake Street, softening the towers until Chicago looked less like a city and more like a set of distant verdicts glowing behind glass. The conference room remained too bright, too polished, too warm on the surface, with amber lights sliding over the walnut table while the corners held a colder blue from the storm. Julian mistook stillness for surrender. He leaned back in his leather chair, smiling again beneath the ceiling lights, one hand open in a gesture meant to look patient, while Brielle sat beside him with her champagne silk skirt arranged carefully around her knees. In the darker reflection near the window, Serena's red dress appeared almost black, her profile quiet, her eyes fixed not on Julian, but on the thin gold trustee seal at the edge of Marcelline Rowe's folder. On one side, the husband performed confidence under warm light. On the other, the wife became a shadow with a memory sharper than any signature. No one breathed loudly. Preston Dale cleared his throat and suggested the team move to message containment, saying the story could still frame Serena as a supportive spouse honoring her mother's legacy through Pierce Capital stewardship. Julian nodded as if that solved the insult, as if a woman's history could be reduced to a paragraph approved by public relations. Brielle whispered that the campaign photographs had already been selected, and the main image showed her standing before a snow-covered gate with the caption, "A new keeper of heritage." Serena turned her head. Marceline's voice cut through the room with clinical restraint, explaining that any public use of Whitlock maternal assets without beneficiary approval could support emergency injunctive relief, a donor reliance freeze, and immediate review under the reserved family name authority embedded in the trust instrument. The bankers lowered their eyes to the papers. Julian's smile thinned. He said those provisions sounded ceremonial, outdated, and unlikely to concern serious capital partners. Marcelline slid one page forward with 2 fingers and replied that serious capital partners generally disliked voidable title, defective authority, and press campaigns built on misrepresented deed control. The sentence landed without drama. Serena remembered her mother sitting at a kitchen table years ago, wearing a plain cardigan, circling scholarship names with a blue pen while saying that wealth without guardianship was just another way for powerful men to move women out of the frame. That memory did not make Serena tremble. It made her precise. She reached for the visitor access band Julian's assistant had placed on her wrist at the start of the evening, the thin black strip that admitted her into a meeting about her own mother's legacy, as if she were a guest. Julian watched, amused, perhaps expecting some sentimental gesture. Serena removed it slowly. The adhesive gave way with a dry, delicate tear, and the only sound was the soft rip of black laminate leaving her skin. She placed the torn band beside Brielle's split announcement card. The room understood before Julian did. At 10:03 p.m., Serena stood, smoothing one hand over the front of her dress, her pearl earrings catching a brief flash of city light as a train moved below on the elevated track near Wabash. The temperature near the glass felt 10 degrees colder than the center of the room, and she welcomed it because it felt honest. She looked at Julian, not as a wife pleading to be seen, but as the architect watching a careless man lean against a wall he did not know was load-bearing. He asked where she thought she was going. Serena picked up nothing from the table. Marcelline closed her folder. Brielle's smile faded at the edges, but she held it in place like expensive fabric pinned over cheap lining. Serena spoke softly enough that the recording device at the center of the table would catch every word. "Revenge is loud. This is consequence." Julian's face hardened, but he did not stand. He still believed the room belonged to him because the lights favored his side, because the bankers had once returned his calls within 2 rings, because Brielle was still close enough to make him look desired. Serena walked toward the frosted glass door, passing the wall screen where her mother's estate had been renamed, repackaged, and priced below its worth by men who had never planted a flower there or funded a girl's tuition from its revenue. Her heels made 4 measured sounds across the marble threshold. Outside the conference room, the corridor was dim, silent, and lined with winter-white orchids that smelled faintly artificial. She entered the private elevator alone, and as the doors began to close, she took out her phone and called Marcelline's secure line. Her voice was calm. "Activate the reversion review." The elevator sealed shut with a low metallic hush, carrying Serena down through 38 floors of glass, snow, and consequence. At 10:27 p.m., Serena stepped out of the black sedan in front of a private title escrow office on West Washington Street, one of the few firms authorized for emergency county e-recording after hours, where snow gathered in the corners of the stone steps and the city lights trembled in the wet pavement like broken jewelry. 38 floors above Lake Street, Julian was still under warm conference lights, laughing too softly with bankers who were no longer laughing back, while Brielle adjusted her champagne silk dress beside the cracked announcement card as if posture could repair authority. In the private escrow lobby, Serena stood alone beneath fluorescent panels, the red of her dress covered now by a long charcoal coat. her face calm against the smell of wet wool, old paper, floor wax, and winter air. The split had become complete. On one side of the city, Julian smiled beneath designer light, still performing ownership over something he had never truly held. On the other, in an escrow office closed to ordinary walk-ins after 5 p.m., Serena waited in silence while the escrow officer opened the secured e-recording suite for Marcelline Rowe. Power had changed rooms. Marcelline arrived 6 minutes later with a navy leather folio, her silver hair dusted with snow, her expression as controlled as a judge reading numbers from a ledger. She placed 4 documents on the steel table: the county deed record, the heritage asset ledger, the beneficiary sole consent covenant, and the trust reversion filing bearing Serena's full maiden name, Serena Elise Whitlock. The escrow officer scanned the first page, then looked up twice when he saw the reserved authority language. He understood enough to become careful. Marcelline spoke without raising her voice, explaining that Julian's transfer relied on spousal proximity, not lawful title, and that the matriarchal heritage preservation trust contained a generational deed reversion clause triggered by unauthorized alienation of protected family assets. Serena listened to the words as if hearing a lock turn inside a wall. Outside, wind dragged snow across Washington Street in white sheets, smearing the headlights of taxis and late buses into long, watery lines. Inside, the e-recording suite held no luxury except precision: gray cabinets, glass partitions, security cameras, and a clock that clicked toward 10:41 p.m. with the hard patience of institutions. Marcelline pointed to the second page and said the Heritage Asset Control Authority allowed Serena to freeze redevelopment rights, donor-facing narratives, image licensing connected to the Whitlock name, and any capital facility using the estate as collateral. Julian had built a press campaign on ice. Serena removed her black leather gloves one finger at a time. Her hands were steady, but the paper felt cold beneath them, colder than the window seam in the trust bank, colder than Julian's voice when he called her emotional history an old arrangement. She remembered her mother signing tuition checks at a Formica kitchen table under a yellow lamp, never calling charity, only responsibility. Serena uncapped Marcelline's fountain pen. The nib touched the beneficiary veto notice at exactly 10:44 p.m. And the only sound was the wet scratch of ink crossing a line Julian thought did not exist. At the bank, Julian's phone began vibrating beside the broken gold foil card, first once, then twice, then 5 times in a row. He ignored the first calls because men like Julian believed urgency was something other people experienced. Brielle watched the screen light up with names from legal, Treasury, public affairs, and investor relations, her smile shrinking as each missed call made the room less flattering. A banker finally stood and answered his own phone near the window. The color left his face. Back inside the e-recording suite, Marcelline slid the trust reversion filing into the digital intake tray and told the recording officer to mark it under protected beneficiary review with immediate title defect notice. The scanner pulled the pages in slowly, one after another, its pale green light moving across Serena's signature like a blade made of law. Serena did not smile. She did not celebrate. She simply watched the machine accept the truth that Julian's room full of money had tried to avoid. When the final page disappeared, the clerk stamped the receipt with the time, date, and filing number. The stamp struck the paper with a flat, final crack. By 10:49 p.m., the title record had begun moving back toward the woman Julian had mistaken for decoration. By 11:06 p.m., Marcelline's office had paired the county e-recording receipt with a formal notice of title defect and delivered it to Pierce Capital, Sterling and Vale Trust Bank, the buyer's counsel, and the preservation group. Julian had promised a clean title by morning. Snow kept falling over West Washington Street, fine and relentless, turning the courthouse steps pale while the high windows of downtown glowed like sealed aquariums above the empty sidewalks. 38 floors above Lake Street, Julian still tried to smile beneath the honey-colored conference lights, his fingers pressed flat against the walnut table, while Brielle sat beside him in champagne silk and stared at a phone that had stopped feeling like an accessory. In the darker records room, Serena stood in silence as the scanner cooled, her name now entered into a system no publicist could charm. The city had divided itself again. Under warm designer lights, Julian performed calm for bankers who were already checking exit clauses. Under cold fluorescent light, Serena created the future with ink, timestamps, and authority. Marcelline opened a second folio, this one thicker and bound in matte black leather, and placed it in front of Serena with the care of someone laying down a foundation stone. The cover did not say Pierce. It said Whitlock House Initiative. Serena touched the name with 2 fingers, and for the first time that night, the memory of her mother felt less like a wound and more like a door opening. Marcelline explained that the initiative had been pre-registered as a charitable legal empowerment vehicle, supported by a restricted heritage revenue assignment, a women's financial autonomy endowment, and a donor reliance protection framework designed to keep its funding separate from Pierce Capital's influence. Serena listened. At 11:13 p.m., a CTA train rattled somewhere beyond the government building, its sound low and metallic under the snow, while a night janitor's cart squeaked once down the hallway and disappeared. The records room smelled of toner, damp wool, and old county paper, but the document in front of Serena carried the clean scent of new ink and expensive stationery. This was not revenge dressed as charity. It was governance built from pain, discipline, and the knowledge that many women lost property not because they were careless, but because powerful men taught rooms to overlook them. Serena turned the first page. Marcelline said the Whitlock House Initiative would provide forensic asset mapping, coercive wealth control review, emergency counsel retainers, and trust literacy programs for women trapped behind elegant doors and polished lies. She added that the recovered estate revenue could not be pledged, borrowed against, renamed, filmed, or repositioned without Serena's direct approval under the Heritage Asset Control Authority. The words were quiet. Their force was not. Across town, Julian's general counsel finally read the title defect notice aloud, and the conference room changed temperature without the thermostat moving. The bankers began closing folders. Prestondale whispered that the 8 a.m. embargo might need to be paused, then amended, then possibly withdrawn, which in public relations meant the story was already bleeding. Brielle asked whether her photo package would still run. No one answered her. Julian's laugh came out thin, almost friendly, as he told the room this was a procedural misunderstanding and that Serena had always been emotional about her mother's affairs. Beneath the lights, he smiled at the word emotional. In the e-recording suite, Serena signed the Whitlock House Initiative activation page without changing expression. The fountain pen moved cleanly across her maiden name, and the only sound was the fine scrape of the nib sealing a future Julian could not enter. Marcelline gathered the signed pages and inserted them into the filing sleeve marked Restricted Beneficiary Controlled Entity. The recording officer stamped the receipt at 11:19 p.m., and the flat crack of the seal echoed once against the metal cabinets. Serena looked down at the printed confirmation number, then folded the receipt into her folder with the same care her mother once used folding scholarship letters for girls she had never met. Outside, snow softened the city's hard edges, but inside the system, everything had become exact. Julian had sold a memory for image. Serena had turned that memory into infrastructure. By midnight, Whitlock House Initiative would own the restoration plan, the donor narrative, the revenue channel, and the legal right to say no. Serena put on her gloves, lifted the black folder to her chest, and walked toward the exit as the city lights trembled beyond the glass. She had not taken back a house. She had reclaimed a name. At 7:36 a.m., the snow over Chicago had turned the city into a muted grid of white roofs, black streets, and red brake lights crawling along Lake Street beneath the glass towers. Inside Sterling and Vale Trust Bank, the same conference room had lost its warmth, though the recessed lights still shone over Julian Pierce's Brioni suit, Brielle Ashford's champagne silk dress, and the untouched silver tray of espresso gone bitter beside the walnut table. Julian stood beneath the honey-colored lights with a prepared smile, telling Prestondale that no one canceled an $18.6 million heritage campaign over a clerical delay, while in the darker reflection of the window Serena was absent, leaving only the cold blue skyline where her silence had been. Her absence filled the room. At the same hour, Serena sat 12 blocks away in a private legal suite above LaSalle Street, her charcoal coat folded neatly over a chair, her red dress vivid beneath a brass banker's lamp. The black Whitlock House Initiative folder opened before her. Snow brushed the windows in fine white streaks, and the city lights below looked pale in the morning storm, as if Chicago itself had not decided whether to wake or remain frozen. Marcelline Rowe stood beside a secure conference screen, while 3 trustees from Sterling and Vale joined by encrypted video, each face stiff with the careful fear of people who recognize title exposure before reputational collapse. Serena said nothing. On one side of the city, Julian smiled beneath designer lighting, trying to make panic look like command. On the other, in the quiet edge of a legal office, Serena watched a system she understood begin to correct itself. Marcelline spoke first, her voice clear through the room, stating that Pierce Capital's transfer was now subject to a recorded title defect notice, a beneficiary veto enforcement, and immediate review under the generational deed reversion clause. One trustee asked whether the morning press rollout could proceed with amended language. Marcelline looked at Serena, then answered that any public representation of control over the Whitlock maternal asset would create donor reliance exposure, collateral impairment, and a potential breach of the Heritage Asset Control Authority. The trustee stopped asking. Back at Sterling and Vale, a banker named Harlan Price finally placed his phone face down and told Julian the preservation group was withdrawing pending clean title verification. Julian laughed once, too lightly, and said Harlan sounded nervous for a man who had earned 7 figures from Pierce Capital last year. Harlan did not smile. Brielle leaned toward Julian and whispered that the photographers were already downstairs, that her stylist had been booked since 5 a.m., and that page 6 would not wait forever for clarity. Julian's jaw tightened. The screen behind them still showed a new keeper of heritage, with Brielle's name glowing in elegant serif type above a snow-covered gate she had never earned the right to represent. Then Preston's phone chimed with the first formal withdrawal from a capital partner in Boston, followed by one from a family office in Palm Beach, then another from a pension advisory group in New York. The sounds came one after another, delicate and devastating. The only sound was the bright glass tap of notifications landing on the table like small verdicts. Julian reached for the printed rollout packet and bent the first page in his hand until the glossy paper creased through Brielle's photograph. In LaSalle Street's quiet legal suite, Serena signed the capital freeze directive at exactly 7:52 a.m., authorizing Whitlock House Initiative to suspend redevelopment rights, donor narrative rights, image permissions, and all revenue assignments attached to the estate restoration. The fountain pen moved once, slow and certain. Marcelline slid the directive into the secure portal and said the freeze would reach Treasury, Public Affairs, and the buyer's counsel within 90 seconds. Serena looked out at the snow and remembered her mother teaching her that dignity was not silence itself, but knowing when silence had gathered enough evidence. Across town, Julian's general counsel received the directive and read only the first paragraph before asking everyone to stop speaking. Brielle asked whether that meant the announcement was delayed. No one corrected the smallness of her question. Julian stared at the screen, at the smiling woman beside his name, at the campaign built from a deed that was already slipping back into Serena's control. Beneath warm lights, he still looked expensive. In the darker machinery of law, he had become unsecured. At 8:14 a.m., the photographers downstairs at Sterling and Vale Trust Bank began packing their lenses back into black cases while snow blew sideways across Lake Street and softened the city's glass towers into pale vertical ghosts. In the conference room above them, Julian still stood under the warm recessed lights, smiling with the stiff discipline of a man refusing to admit that the room had already left him. Brielle remained beside the presentation screen in her champagne silk dress, but her hand no longer rested near his. It hovered over her phone, checking messages, checking mentions, checking whether the world was still watching. Attention was the only climate Brielle knew how to live in. 12 blocks away, in the dim legal suite above LaSalle Street, Serena sat in quiet profile, while Marcelline Rowe reviewed the next layer of filings: the donor narrative suspension, the restricted revenue intercept, and the family name misrepresentation notice. The snow against Serena's window made a soft, granular sound, almost like sand moving across glass, and the brass lamp turned her black folder's gold lettering into a small, steady flame. On one side of the city, Julian laughed beneath expensive lights, trying to keep Brielle, bankers, and counsel inside the myth of control. On the other, Serena sat in a colder corner of law, saying almost nothing while every silent document moved with purpose. The contrast was no longer emotional. It was structural. Brielle broke first. She asked Preston whether the morning photographs could be reframed around her personal style, maybe without mentioning ownership, maybe just a woman preserving beauty. Something soft enough for magazines, but clean enough for counsel. Preston stared at her as if she had brought perfume to a tax hearing. Julian snapped that the campaign was not about dresses, then caught himself because the photographers might still be nearby, because walls in buildings like Sterling and Vale always seemed to remember rich men's worst sentences. Brielle's face changed. The sweetness thinned, and beneath it appeared the calculation Serena had recognized from the first minute. Not love, not loyalty, only appetite wrapped in silk. She said Julian had promised a board-facing advisory title, a restoration budget, and a public profile independent of Serena. The word promised landed badly. Harlan Price looked toward Julian's general counsel. General counsel looked at the ceiling. At 8:22 a.m., Marcelline sent the family name misrepresentation notice to Pierce Capital's outside counsel, identifying unauthorized use of the Whitlock maternal name in promotional materials and freezing all donor-facing language under the reserved family name authority. Serena watched the confirmation bar reach 100%. The only sound was the soft electronic chime of a notice delivered to men who had mistaken permission for absence. In the conference room, Julian's phone lit again, this time with an email from the Boston Capital partner terminating participation under its reputational integrity reserve and clean title reliance addendum. Then Palm Beach followed. Then New York. The withdrawals did not shout. They stacked. Brielle saw the names and understood only that the room was becoming smaller. She took one careful step away from Julian, then another, adjusting the shoulder of her silk dress as if distance could be mistaken for dignity. Julian noticed. His smile disappeared. He asked if she was seriously concerned about optics at a moment like this. Brielle answered that optics were the only reason he had brought her there. The bankers heard it. Preston heard it. Even the untouched espresso tray seemed to hold the sentence in its polished silver reflection. Julian reached for the glossy campaign packet, the one with Brielle's photograph beneath the words "A New Keeper of Heritage," and his hand closed too tightly around the corner. The paper tore across her printed face with a bright, ugly whisper. No one moved. Across LaSalle Street, Serena signed the restricted revenue intercept at exactly 8:31 a.m., redirecting every permitted restoration dollar into Whitlock House Initiative's protected account for women's financial autonomy programs. Marcelline said the intercept would prevent Pierce Capital from borrowing against the estate, licensing its image, or treating future donor pledges as balance sheet support. Serena nodded once. She did not ask whether Julian knew. Consequence did not need an audience to become real. Back at Sterling and Vale, Brielle gathered her cream coat and small designer bag, her voice low but sharp as she told Julian she had not agreed to be embarrassed for a failed asset play. The phrase cut through him because it sounded like something he would have said. She walked out before the official cancellation memo arrived. Julian remained under the warm lights, still rich, still tailored, still surrounded by people. But for the first time that morning he looked alone. In the darker architecture of the city, Serena did not turn back. She was no longer reclaiming a deed. She was removing every place he had tried to stand on her name. 3 years later, at 6:48 p.m., Snow returned to Chicago with the same quiet persistence, laying a thin white veil over LaSalle Street while the upper windows of the Civic Legal Forum burned gold against the blue winter evening. Inside the Grand Meridian Conference Center, 12 blocks from the Trust Bank where Julian Pierce had once smiled beneath friendly lights, Serena Whitlock stood backstage in a tailored crimson gown, pearl earrings glowing softly against her skin, the black Whitlock House Initiative folder resting beneath her hand. She was no longer introduced as someone's wife. Across the lobby, Julian stood beneath a chandelier near the donor wall, still in an expensive suit, still handsome in the distant way polished marble could be handsome, but the room no longer leaned toward him. His laugh sounded practiced, then thinner, then almost unnecessary, as younger attorneys and foundation directors passed him to greet Serena's team. On one side of the glass atrium, Julian smiled under warm light, trying to borrow the old shape of importance from a room that had stopped returning it. On the other, in the quieter shadow near the stage curtain, Serena stood still while snow and city lights reflected behind her like a crown made of weather. The split was merciless. The event program listed Whitlock House Initiative's numbers with clean American precision. 4,800 women served, $312 million in protected assets identified, 91 emergency retainers funded, and 42 coercive wealth control cases referred for civil review. The same legal world that once allowed Julian to call her stepped back, now stood in line to hear her discuss forensic asset mapping, beneficiary authority literacy, donor reliance ethics, and the use of restricted revenue intercepts to protect women from financial erasure. Serena read none of it as revenge. She read it as architecture. Marcelline Rowe, older now but still severe in Navy, adjusted the edge of Serena's speech folder and said the trustees from Sterling and Vale had confirmed the new endowment tranche under the Women's Financial Autonomy Reserve. Serena nodded. Her hand brushed the cover of the folder, where the gold Whitlock lettering had been pressed deep into the leather, and for a moment she remembered the county records room, the smell of old paper, the scanner's pale green light moving over her name. The memory did not ache the way it once had. It steadied her. A young program director approached and whispered that a woman from Milwaukee had just arrived with her pro bono counsel after winning back access to a trust her husband had hidden for 7 years. Serena smiled gently, not for cameras, but because the work had traveled farther than the pain that created it. Beyond the curtain, applause rose as her introduction began. The only sound was the clean click of Serena closing the brass clasp on the Whitlock folder before stepping toward the light. In the lobby, Julian heard her name spoken as if it belonged to history now, not gossip. He turned toward the stage at exactly 7 p.m., holding a glass of sparkling water he had not tasted. The city lights outside climbed the glass walls behind him, and for a second his reflection looked layered over the snowfall. Older, smaller, less certain where to stand. Serena walked onto the stage to a standing ovation, not loud in the cheap way of spectacle, but full, sustained, earned. Under the white stage lights, she did not look like a woman who had survived a public humiliation. She looked like a woman who had converted silence into an institution. She spoke about ownership as safety, education as armor, and dignity as something measurable when law finally places a woman's name where it belongs. Julian watched from the back while donors took notes. Marcelline sat in the front row, expression unreadable, hands folded over the program. When Serena mentioned the Matriarchal Heritage Preservation Trust, the Heritage Asset Control Authority, and the responsibility of capital to recognize rightful consent, several attorneys in the room nodded as if hearing doctrine instead of biography. Julian understood the difference too late. After the speech, in the marble corridor near the west windows, he approached her while snow brushed the city into silver behind the glass. His voice was softer than she remembered. He said he had been wrong, that he had not understood how much she carried, that he had mistaken her quiet for distance when it had always been strength. Serena listened without interrupting. Beneath the chandelier, Julian tried to smile like the past could still recognize him, but in the darker reflection beside the window, Serena stood calm, complete, and unreachable. She did not punish him with anger. She simply let him hear the silence he had once misread. Julian stood with Serena beside the west windows of the Grand Meridian Conference Center while snow moved over LaSalle Street in slow silver sheets, and the city lights climbed the glass behind them like distant witnesses. At 7:46 p.m., the applause from the ballroom had faded into the low music of donors, lawyers, trustees, and women who had come not for gossip, but for proof that a name could be restored after someone powerful tried to erase it. Serena held the black Whitlock House Initiative folder against her side, the same gold lettering deep in the leather, the same calm in her face that Julian had once mistaken for emptiness. She had reclaimed the deed, not as a trophy, but as a correction. The county record now reflected the Whitlock Trust. The unauthorized transfer had been reversed, the buyer had been released through settlement, and every permitted dollar from the restored property now moved through protected channels supporting women who needed legal counsel before silence became a trap. Julian looked at her, as if the facts had finally become heavier than his pride. He said he had spent 3 years replaying that night at Sterling and Vale. The cracked announcement card, the bankers leaving, Brielle walking out, the campaign dying before sunrise. He said he understood now that he had not sold a property. He had tried to sell her mother's memory, her authority, and the part of her life he had never earned the right to touch. Serena listened without softening the truth. Outside, a bus rolled through slush below the window, its red lights stretching across the wet pavement, while the chandelier above Julian made his expensive suit look almost borrowed. On one side of the glass, he stood under warm light, smiling faintly with the worn hope of a man asking the past to become useful again. On the other, in the darker reflection, Serena stood still, complete, and beyond negotiation. He asked if forgiveness meant there was still a way back. The question entered the space between them carefully, almost politely, but it carried the old assumption that her heart was another asset waiting for his revised offer. Serena's fingers rested on the folder clasp. The brass edge was smooth beneath her thumb, warmer now than the cold paper she had signed in the ear-recording suite 3 winters before. She remembered the fountain pen scratching across the beneficiary veto notice, the scanner accepting the trust reversion filing, the flat crack of the county stamp as the title record began its journey home. That sound had not been vengeance. It had been correction. Julian said he missed her mind, then her steadiness, then the way rooms changed when she entered them. Serena heard the order of those confessions and understood that even regret had a hierarchy. He missed the structure she gave his life before he fully understood the woman who built it. The realization did not hurt her anymore. It only clarified the distance. Marcelline Rowe passed at the far end of the corridor with 2 trustees from Sterling and Vale, giving Serena a slight nod before continuing toward the reception. In the ballroom, a young woman from Milwaukee stood beside her pro bono counsel, crying quietly over a court order that restored her access to a hidden trust after 7 years of financial control. Serena saw her through the open doors and knew that was where the reclaimed deed truly belonged now. Not inside a frame, not beneath Julian's name, not inside a campaign video, but inside a living system that turned inheritance into protection. Julian followed her gaze and seemed to understand that he was no longer the center of the ending. He apologized again, this time without performance. Serena accepted it with a small nod, not because it repaired the past, but because she no longer wanted the past pulling at her sleeve. Forgiveness, she had learned, was not a doorway back into the old house. It was the key you set down after you stopped needing to prove you escaped. She stepped away from the window, the snowlight brightening the edge of her crimson gown, and Julian reached for one last sentence, one last opening, one last version of her that might still turn around. Serena looked at him with dignity, not anger. The deed remains mine. Then she walked back toward the ballroom, toward Whitlock House Initiative, toward the women waiting beneath the lights, and Julian remained by the glass with the soft reflection of falling snow settling over his face. This story is a fictional narrative created for entertainment, reflection, and educational purposes. Any resemblance to real people, places, or events is purely coincidental.